Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Four Mothers of the Women's Spirituality Online Resource Center. I'm your hostess, Vajra, and I'm the curator of the project. And today we're here with Spider Redgold in Australia. Hello, Spider.
Hello everyone. Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here. Spider, what I'm going to do first is give a short introduction that gives a context to our discussion. So that the people have a bigger perspective for where we're coming from. The women's spirituality emerged as a major component of what's now called the second wave of women's liberation. And this emergence took place in the 1970s and 1980s. But many people today do not know about these four mothers of women's spirituality. These are courageous, radical, and by radical I mean to the root, pioneering women who developed an authentic spiritual experiences and practices outside the boundaries of patriarchal religions. These feminists followed their conviction, their passion, and they built upon a growing scholarly body of historical knowledge, and some brought through intact indigenous teachings and wisdom to help us connect with the original nature-honoring and female-honoring spirituality that preceded the past 6,000 to 10,000 years of patriarchal father gods. And these women, these feminists, along with many other feminists, developed a diverse spiritual orientation based in respect, reverence, and relationship with all. These four mothers are not only historically significant, but they're significant because of many of them are continuing their work today. And that's why the Online Resource Center was created, to be able to get an overview of through personal testimonies and through personal recollections of the first 2 decades of the women's spirituality movement, and then to see how that work of each woman has evolved and what she's doing today. So we're inviting you to meet these women via taped interviews, with additional interviews and resources to be added as time goes on. And today I am speaking with Spider Redgold in May 2018. And I'd like to read Spider's biography here before we begin. Spider Redgold is a Caucasian woman of spirit, descended through her mother lines from the travelers. Through her father line, she can trace her blood back to the Viking invasions of Yorkshire around 900 CE. She was born on Choctaw land in the USA. And she was taken to Yorkshire when her parents returned there, and then brought to Australia as she was a teenager. Her life experiences have delivered to her a global perspective on ceremonial work. She has been given spirit teachings in Cherokee, Choctaw, Luo, which is Kenyan, and 3 Aboriginal nations. She created and wrote the She-Moon Cycle of Days, a global witches' almanac, published from 1987 to 1993, and now in the collection at the National Library of Australia. She has a regular talkback segment called The Good Witch of Oz on radio JJJ in the early 1990s. She had a regular talkback in the early 1990s, and she appeared on Steve Vizard's In Melbourne Tonight, and in 1993 debated exorcism with the Archbishop of Melbourne on ABC Radio National. I'm sure that was very interesting. She now spends her days busy about the Tree of Life drumming, making art and ceremony, and doing academic research in art and anthropology on images of goddesses, warrior women, and monsters. That's very intriguing. Spider, welcome. I'm so delighted to have you here.
Oh, look, it's wonderful to have the technology to be able to talk like this on matters of spirit between Sydney and California.
It is. It's amazing. And then to have all the people that are going to be sharing this conversation with us as they come into the Online Resource Center and get a taste of what it was like.
Yeah, I get goosebumps when I talk about it, like now, and I always trust my goosebumps. If an idea gives me goosebumps, I do my best to carry it out.
Good advice. Good advice. The body leads the way, doesn't it? It tells us.
It
And
does.
some things, yeah. And I would like to know how you stepped onto your spiritual path into what we're calling women's spirituality and what that means for you. Would you share that with us?
Well, my mother's family come from the English gypsies, the travellers, and we could buy warts, and I always knew that there was something beyond the material realm. And I did not know until I was in my 20s that other people didn't know this. So I left religiosity and the Anglican Church at 16 when I had a moment of enwizenment about religiosity and was seeking and seeking. And I found in the late 70s Z Budapest's little books that at that stage were two Gestetner, one a strange yellow and one a strange green, called The Feminist Book of Lights and Shadows. And I know that my response was, there's another one. So I had a very clear identity of knowing that I was a witch. When I was 6 or 7, one of my mother's friends grabbed my wrists and said, Dorothy, she's got witch's hands.
Ooh.
And so I always look at my hands and go, oh, these are witch's hands. How do I recognize someone else's? So that imprinted on me as being very significant that I had this mark. And as a teenager, I would plug myself into the ley lines of England and Yorkshire and sit on top of the broken off standing stones and dance in the ancient spots, not because I knew what I was doing, but just with that pubescent wisdom and wildness of this is what I am doing, not with any reason or intellect. So finding, first of all, Z Budapest, and then Starhawk, and then Charlene Spretnek and Susan Brownmiller, who reinterpreted the fairy tales and the myths. And so there was one about the practice and honouring witch, and the other about undoing the patriarchal lies. So that's where I fell into it, and it was probably late 1970s, 77, 78, that kind of time.
And what was around you you were in Australia, so what was around you in Australia? Was there anyone to turn to there?
There was a vibrant women's liberation movement that I had been part of for 6 or 7 years, and theatre that we wrote for ourselves, and events and music, and wonderful women's liberation leftist politics and meeting places. And so I remember that another woman and I fell into conversation, and there was a lot of guru-led activity in spirit, the gurus, the Sanskrit, the Hindu, those kind of things. And so we wrote, and the Gay and Lesbian Metropolitan Community Church was starting, so there was gay and lesbian Christianity available. And we put up a small notice in 3 women's meeting places, healing centres, health centres, at a dance, and said, we are non-aligned spiritual women seeking others who are also non-aligned, because we knew we didn't want to have the debate about the gurus or the debate about the God. And from that, we formed the most beautiful circle of women that met every week for a couple of years. And we knew nothing, and we just trusted what I now call the self-revealing path. And I put an apostrophe between the S and the E. So it's revealing the self, and it's sort of reversing that ownership. You know, you normally put apostrophe S to own something. Well, this is self, the self in me, and it is the self-revealing path that you reveal your elven, your magic, your roots in what makes you dance in harmony with the universal world.
There's a theme as I've been talking to the foremothers, that there's an inner knowing, usually as a child, and some connection to nature, and then getting together with other women, though there's not a structure, there's nothing, you know, you got the information from Z Budapest and Brown Miller and Spretnak with the retelling of the myths and stories, but that personal contact in a circle with other women and the things that are generated, to me that seems like it's absolutely the core of women's spirituality, what comes through when you come together with that intent.
And we very clearly, Australians are pretty anarchic, really, and we didn't read a book and follow the pattern. We would sit silently until someone suggested something like, I would like to lead a meditation, I would like to sing a song, I've brought this object that I would like to talk about. And in between, then we would sit silently again. So there was a certain, I don't actually know whether anybody was Quakers, and I didn't know that that was a Quaker pattern when we were doing it. So whether that just arose or whether, I don't know where that pattern came, but that's how we did it, was we would just gather and arrive and sit in silence. So there was no greeting. There was just this trust, the energy that we created together as members of the women's liberation movement seeking spirit.
I love that. I've never heard of that before, of a circle working that way, other than Quakers. But that is absolutely beautiful. You just let what your inner knowing arise and trust the spontaneity. That's something that women could do today. That would be a good pattern to follow, I think.
And yeah. it is a wonderful leveler of power and personality.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. I have some talking points that you've given me, and you've commented that what is different about the ceremonial year in Australia as opposed to elsewhere. Do you want to address that and share that with us?
Well, yeah, that's one of my very early learnings. And while I was part of this first circle, I was walking down a city street in May, going to a ceremony that I had insisted we had to reverse. So it was Samhain, not Beltane, because it was May. And we're the other way round in the Southern Hemisphere, and the moon, the crescent moon, is the other way round, and all sorts of things. And I'm in winter. This is woolly. Winter has arrived here, nearly. So I'm going to this ceremony, that ritual, we call them rituals, going to a witch's ritual. And on the footpath, in the rain, was an autumn leaf. And I was thinking, oh, this is nice. Yes, it's definitely autumn. We can't just copy this stuff from the Northern Hemisphere. But then there was frangipani flowers in the autumn rain in front of me. And I was in sandals and socks because it was raining, but it wasn't that cold. And I knew I was going to take my shoes off and didn't want soggy socks when I got to the ritual. And in that moment, I could see that this wheel of the year didn't work in Australia because we had frangipani flowers and autumn leaves, neither of which are indigenous to Australia. So it's like we're bringing and we're colonizing, and I've already gone through the debate and convinced this circle of women that we need to not just do the rules. Now I need to go further. And so the rest of my exploration has been the self-revealing path, that if I walk with awareness, the path will be revealed.
So that same level of trust.
Yes. And I developed not a circle. It's not a circle. I've twisted that wheel of the year. And so you go in a lemniscate, in the infinity sign.
Mm-hmm.
And you have one extreme season on one end. I'll put my hands visible. On one end, you have the wet season. On the other end, you have the dry season, or you have the cold season, and you have the warm season. And then you cross through the middle. So this is not a wheel. It's the infinity symbol.
Oh.
And that's the solstices. You know, you've got the solstices and the equinoxes, and then the cross quarter days. But the equinoxes, so we have spring and autumn at the same time, because in Australia, except for the bits that are snowy, the Australian native trees are growing new leaves and the birds are nesting, because the winter time is the time when food is secure. The summertime, there's dry desert heat. You know,
right.
the Halloween is not in autumn. It's in late summer. It's high January, February, where old people die of heat exhaustion. Right. They don't die of the cold, they die of heat exhaustion. The news on TV says, check your relatives if they're living alone and they're not likely to have air conditioning. Old people die in January from heat exhaustion.
Yeah.
So, like, it really changes the year. And one of the things I'm really proud about, one of your work questions was, who did I inspire? Is 20 years on from when I published that, the Melbourne Botanical Gardens has published a book that says we have two springs.
Oh, right.
We have the spring in autumn and we have the spring in spring. And it's like, yes, you know, I might have said it 20 years ago, but now it's finally being widely accepted as a natural part and actually watching what really happens in the world.
That is fascinating. That's fascinating about Australia, and just coming from your actual observance and your connection to nature and being present. And isn't that what spirituality is? A great deal of spirituality is.
There were 300 Aboriginal languages in Australia when the white invaders arrived. And each of those languages has seasons and variations and astronomy and astrology and creation stories, and they have a seasonal practice. I certainly don't know many of them, and many of them have been lost through population loss. But of the few that I do know, the seasons are connected to variation. So instead of being locked to a written calendar, they say, this is the season when such and such flowers. This is the season when this bird arrives. And that will be the beginning of that magical ceremonial season. And it will go from when the bird arrives to when something fruits, or so that they're very much able to shift for different climatic conditions during each year, because each year is a little bit different. And so they do not have the same kind of calendar that we have, which is locked, although they did have some stone clocks.
Which also kind of brings up climate change. They'll be able to adapt more easily, but also they'll notice the changes in, you know, the birds not coming back at the same time. Yeah.
Plants and birds will exist. If those plants and birds are not extinct. Many of the plants became extinct as white people moved across and turned it into cattle and sheep country, and they were eaten out. So there's a great loss of habitat, and that loss has meant loss of ceremonial knowledge as well.
Yeah. Spider, you combine radical feminism and goddess spirituality. How do they fit together in your life? And for those that don't know, who'll be listening to this or watching this, who don't know what goddess is, if you could give a sense of your understanding of goddess and goddess spirituality and how radical feminism fits together with that.
So I'm never sure I'm comfortable with feminist. I always try and say I'm a member of the women's liberation movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And because there's all sorts of flavors of feminism. And really, I feel like the women's liberation movement was what later became called radical feminism because there were other flavors of feminism that developed.
Mm-hmm.
So as a women's liberationist, I measure my analysis and my actions by, is this good for women? How will it help to make women more free? If it helps to make me more free, is that at the expense of another woman's freedom? So we all have to come together, no woman left behind. It's got to be working for all women. And as a women's liberationist, I understood patriarchal religion in terms of the way it molded minds and controlled thought when I left the church at 16. So, but I didn't know that there was an alternative. I just became anti-religious, but certainly knowing there were non-material beings. There were ghosts, there were pixies, there were other creatures and beings. Animals can talk to you. Things that Western science denies and religion denies. So then I found women's liberation, and within that, there was the concept that we can be free of God the Father. Somewhere in the 80s, I found Beyond God the Father by Mary Daly and then read everything after that. So how do they fit together? To me, women's spiritual path, women's spiritual practice gives one the internal resources to resist the comfort zone that patriarchy pretends to provide. Yeah,
that is said so.
Practice strengthens your resolve, strengthens your ability. One of my joking things is, if I had amethyst fire from my fingertips, then I would need to be very balanced before I started throwing it at people. And so the spiritual practice gives me the balance that if I'm going to flash somebody with fire from my fingertips, I'm flashing the right person. That kind of ethical balance around wielding great power.
Yeah. Beautifully said. What are some of the key aspects of the spiritual teachings that you have received from such geographical and spiritually diverse sources? You've brought together a lot of streams of wisdom and teachings. So what are some of the key aspects of those?
Asking permission. I was given permission in 1984 to do white women's spirit business on Gauna land in South Australia by the elder auntie. We call them aunties. And it was very funny. It was International Women's Day and we wanted to be doing these things. And I said, we have to ask permission. And I knew we had to ask permission because I'd been working with Aboriginal women doing really big peace camps on their land. And they would say, you can go here, but not there because this is the women's camping ground. Stay here, don't go that way, do this. And so I said, we have to ask permission. They said, it's in a public place. And I said, no, we have to ask permission. We're dealing with the spirit world. And by then I also knew that there were Aboriginal animals that spoke to me with spirit voices. So somewhere I can cross over, and that's problematic. But I went off on International Women's Day, and I walked up to an Aboriginal woman and I said, I want to talk to somebody about things like sunrise and sunset and women's business and women who greet the sunrise and sunset. You know, do you know somebody who I could talk to that would be happy to talk to me about this stuff? And she pointed to someone, and I went over and I said the same thing, trying not to use spirituality and sounding like I wanted them to do ceremony for us. And so they pointed me round and round and round and round. And then eventually someone said, no, you've got to go and see Mary. Now, Mary has passed, so my apologies if this offends anyone that I've used her name. But I got her address and I rang her up and I asked to come and see her, and I brought the gift of food, and I turned up, and it was the first woman I had spoken to. And I just looked at her and laughed. And she looked at me and laughed. And she said, oh, I like those grapes. And I said, have you finished messing with my head yet? Have I passed? Are you willing to talk to me?
Yeah. And what did she say?
We talked a lot, and she said yes, but it's got to be just white women's business. And I said, well, might be that it's just invaders' business, because there's women who come who consider themselves to be women of colour, but they're not Indigenous women. So we negotiated what was going to happen, but subsequently I became very good friends with her daughter, who's my age. And she came to our gatherings. We would regularly have gatherings on the solstices of 4 days or so, and camp out or live in a youth camp or whatever. And Mary's daughter would come. And so we shared lots and lots of ceremonies together after that.
Asking permission. Yeah.
Yes, that's one thing. Asking permission. Being humble, apologising in case, noticing that all sorts of strange things happen. I went over to Western Australia, asked permission, opened up my suitcase to pack, and there was a frog in it. And it's like, how did a frog get in my suitcase, in my cupboard? And then I got all the way over to Perth and meet up with the traditional owning custodian auntie. And turns out she's Frog Tribe.
Ah, nice. Yeah.
And she told me that she'd called her husband to kill a spider, and then realised that she was meeting up with this woman called Spider, and that she probably should not take on white ways of being scared of spiders. And then I said, well, I had this frog. And so we actually discovered that on the same day, we had both had symbols in our lives of the other power animal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an omen.
Trusting those things.
Yeah. Yeah. The universe speaks to us. And what?
I used to have a different name, and Spider Redgold was my ritual name. And when I was in Kenya, I had arranged to meet up with a witch doctor woman, and she erupted out of her hut throwing things at me. And I was traveling with a Luo woman who was an interpreter for us, and this was a Luo witch doctor woman. And Simprose said, she managed to get her to stop throwing things at us, because they were like cooking pots and rocks and pieces of wood and screaming and throwing things. And she was very angry because she said that Simprose had brought someone who was lying. And Simprose had introduced me by my previous name. And then I caught on to what was happening in the conversation and said, hey, wait a minute, tell her that I'm Spider Redgold. And as soon as I said that, she said, well, why didn't you tell me that at the first? And we sat down and had a really lovely time. And so I don't think Simprose had ever bothered to tell her my name. She had just said, I'm traveling with this white woman and she wants to meet you, and she does magic and ceremony in her own country. And then when we turned up and Simprose said my name, the woman, however, knew that I had a spiritual name that she had not been told. And once I told her my spiritual name, she was very happy to know me. And so when I came home from Kenya, I changed my name by deed poll and have walked in the world with a passport and a driver's license that says Spider Redgold. And when border security look at me, I just look them straight back in the eye and say, yes, that's my name.
Very good. Very good. You said earlier that you just mentioned sort of parenthetically that you spirit animals talked to you, and that was problematic in terms of animals from another tradition, from a tradition you're not part of. Is that what you meant? And what's problematic about that? Yeah.
Well, in Australia, there was genocide, and in the 1970s, Australian people, Aboriginal people, were only 1% of the population. I think they're now between 3 and 4%. So the death rate has decreased, but there was intentional massacres and resistance, and that history is lost. And there are some language groups that say things like, the only thing we have left is a possum skin, and that's in a museum in England. So their wisdom keepers are gone, and the stories have not been passed on. Mm. And so for an upstart white woman to start saying, I can see your song lines, your spirit animals talk to me, is okay with some women. And they say, it doesn't matter whether you're black or white, it depends whether you can hear what the trees say. But other women, and often politicized urban women, are very angry and consider that I am stealing, appropriating. And so I've had to walk a very careful path about this. And this is why I stopped. 25 years ago, I stopped talking publicly and I stopped writing. And I very well knew that I needed to be old. And now this talking to you, agreeing to talk to you, giving a workshop at the last Mitch Fest is part of me going, okay, I'm old, I'm 67, you know, I'm going to be able to manage whatever comes of deciding to share what I know and what I've learned and what I've been taught and what I've been given and what I've invented, and I'm going to do it.
So being old gives you why does being old make it different? Make it better?
Well, it's probably, what I say now is different from then, but when I stopped, I was in my prime, I was fit and slender and a surfer and a wild woman and apparently had every privilege of the beautiful white woman.
Right.
And then I was also saying, and I have this cool name and I know about your spirituality. And in fact, I don't know about their spirituality. What I know is when I look at a landscape, I see things that other people don't see. Mm-hmm. I can say the dancers go this way, the hunters go that way. This is a singing ground. This is a sleeping ground. I have no idea how I know it, but I know it. Mm-hmm. And when I sleep, one wonderful thing is I was sleeping one day under a tree out in the bush, and I woke up to hear the galahs talking. Now, galahs are very silly parrots, but they're saying, she can hear us. She's not supposed to hear us. She can hear us. She's listening to us. And they were just talking about the fact that one of them realized that I had woken up and I could hear them, and that they were having this conversation between themselves. And parrots don't say very much, but I can hear parrots. And occasionally the spirit keeper of a particular part of land will pop out and often tell me which track I should take.
Uh-huh.
Spinifex will, help me not go the wrong way, that kind of thing, not get lost.
Yeah.
But that is a very potentially arrogant thing to say. Your land keeps me safe,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for people who were stolen.
Yeah.
Like, there was a policy to take Aboriginal children and tell them they weren't Aboriginal and forbid them to speak their language and bring them up as white, adopt them into very Christian, heteropatriarchal families. And then here I am coming along and saying, I know more about your land than you do. And it was very problematic, and it is still very problematic. And I still struggle. I have many, many secrets I've never spoken. And I don't know whether I ever will, but as I'm coming into teaching again, I also feel that now that I am old, I have 25 years more wisdom of how to say things and when to introduce them and what I might say. And I also know that I will get it wrong for some, and the same thing will be okay with others. And I will have to weather the storm of that happening and have that conversation. And I'm ready to have that conversation.
Yeah. That's very, very interesting, because on one hand, these beings are speaking to you. They are presenting themselves to you in some cases, such as the spirit keeper telling you to go this way, not that way. And who are you, as any white woman, Aboriginal woman, who are you to say no? Who are you to reject that? And yet you've got to navigate receiving that and speaking about it or not speaking about it in a very respectful, wise way. It is quite a line to navigate. So that's very interesting, especially since so much has been lost in the Aboriginal tradition. And we have the same, of course, dynamic in the United States, the genocide and the co-opting and the arrogant white person taking over Native American spiritual practices, or the same kind of dynamic problem here.
And this was true of my parents, who were English migrants to Louisiana. And they were incredibly racist, but they also were not particularly well educated. And so they knew that they weren't going to be friends with African Americans because they were in Louisiana. And it was before Kennedy, before desegregation. I call it complete apartheid. I grew up until I was 10 in complete apartheid. But they had these Native American friends. I have no idea how they made these friends, but they had these Native American friends who became godmothers to some of my siblings. And the woman was a Cherokee Choctaw woman, and she taught me about things that were appropriate for my age at 6 or 7. And so when I arrive in Australia, I'm not just a plain white woman. I'm a white woman that had some Native American teaching. I'm a white woman that lived in Yorkshire on the traditional lands of my father for 1,000 years, and plugged myself into the ley lines. I used to play truant to go and sit on top of these standing stones for no particular reason except that I wanted to sit there. And I afterwards have read the works of the fellow who has the the place up in Scotland that I can never remember the name of, that grows roses in the snow.
Findhorn.
And he explained, pardon? That's
Findhorn?
it, yes, Findhorn. I heard him on a tape once, and he was explaining that the natural world draws you to do things, and you don't know why, but if you're willing to do them, it's almost like you receive a charge that then allows you to go on to the next one, and you receive, and eventually you become enwizened or empowered. And so I believe that my attraction to these places in England was like plugging my finger into the psychic PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
Because
mm-hmm.
I know that I was incessant, and I would play truant 3 days a week, but I would just sit alone on top of this particular broken off standing stone. And it was I could curl up small enough so that people on the ground didn't know I was there, and I could hear them passing, but I would just be right on top of it in the sun for day after day after day.
Beautiful. Absorbing something, absorbing many things, I'm sure. You know.
Absorbing something. It was something that drew me to do it.
Yeah. You've done a lot of research into goddess imagery, and continue to do so. What are some of the impressions or wisdom or key findings that you have from your research into goddess imagery?
Oh, okay. So I'm going to apologize now if anybody's offended by what I just thought I discovered, but I'm very much in the heart of the transgender resistance here in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And in my artwork, I would do females and be told, oh, you can't tell. And there's a very strong resistance of women doing cunts. Men can do cunts, men can do genitalia, but women can't, you know. And so I thought, well, I'm going to look at this. And I took the goddess imagery of the Neolithic time, Paleolithic and Neolithic. And then I compared it. I developed a taxonomy of stance and gaze and accoutrement. And I compared it to computer gaming.
Mm.
And the people that go to those computer gaming conferences, and to the goddess movement at Glastonbury. And I took their images and I said, okay, these are the ancient ones, and they are female images, and we know they're female because of the triangles and the breasts and the stance and the accoutrements. And what about these? And I compared the two cultures too, and they both dress up. They both revere female figures of warriors and goddesses and heroines. They both have ritual parts of, you know, the Star Trek greeting or the Wonder Woman handshake or those. So there was a lot of sort of sociological similarities that not many people consider to be similarities. But what I found was that the images used in the Glastonbury groups are more like the ancient ones. And the images used in the computer groups are more like pornographic ones. So there's forward gaze, useful accoutrements, a balanced stance of strength, uplifted head and arms, whereas in the computer ones they were bound, they were looking down or away, they were scantily dressed, it was inappropriate for what they would do, you know, half naked going to battle, that kind of thing. And so while there were great similarities, there were also great differences. But in the current climate of transphilia, no piece of art that is representing a woman can actually be considered to be representing a woman unless there are words. Like for the last 37,000 years, a woman was a woman because it was a woman, and we recognized that. Whereas now you have to actually have words, which means you have to have a living language. Because if I make a woman and put it on a display in an art gallery, and it doesn't matter how anatomically correct the woman is, someone will come along and say, it could be trans, just because they want to be social justice warrior perfect. And so now, and this pisses me off unbelievably. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say that on your tape, but
you are allowed. You're allowed.
Full of rage, yeah. Absolutely full of rage, that it was 30,000 years before they made a three-dimensional man. The oldest female figurine is 37,000 years ago. The oldest male figurine is 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. And they keep trying to say there's a man in the middle there somewhere. They keep trying to find, there's cave paintings, but the actual three-dimensionality, 30,000 years, they did not bother to make a male figure as a three-dimensional statuette. And now I make them, and I get told I can't prove they're women without putting words next to them on the wall. This is a woman, because I say it's a woman. I know it's a woman. This is shocking. What are the archaeologists going to do? What are the archaeologists going to do? Then when the trans are dead, they're going to be male corpses, you know, but our art, our three-dimensional statuettes, our center core imagery is stolen. And I am enraged. And this is part of saying, okay, I'm going to keep talking. I fought a court case for 4 years and won to protect women's space here in Australia. And the bastards changed the law on me afterwards. We won the case and they changed the law because we won.
Wow.
So this is my women's space. Women's ground is my fight, and I dare them to come and get me. I say, you try and come and get me, because I will not be silenced.
I applaud you for that, Spider. I do. It is
not fear them.
It is. Thank you. It is a massive, complete disconnect from reality. What you're describing, and I think that's one of the reasons that the understanding original human spirituality, which was focused on female and on nature and on woman as the embodiment of that capacity to bring life through her body, you know, to bleed with the moon without dying, all of that has thousands and thousands of years of history. And your art and your knowledge and the women's spirituality is crucial to bringing us back to sanity from this sort of trance.
Yeah, I want to go in two directions from there. One is scientific and the other is political. So
okay.
The scientific one, the Big Bang Theory is wrong. Male science has such a short view that it cannot recognize that what it sees as the ever-expanding universe is actually simply one pulsation in the great female orgasm. And that the creation of the universe and what they are busily photographing is orgasmic, and it's female orgasmic, but it is on such a scale that we are just part of one pulsation, and they measure it and go, oh, it keeps on going and going and going and going. And we go, yes, and then it will come and come and come and go and go and go, and they just have it's so ejaculatory. The Big Bang Theory should be rejected without any further knowing of science, simply because it is so ejaculatory. But the universe is orgasmic. So that's that one side. The other side is somewhere along the line in the recovering, and Monique Wittig with When You Can't Remember, Invent, we recovered the religion of the great goddess as a past, but we seem to be taking it forward. And this is an important part of what I have learned from my decades of deep, inquisitive spiritual practice. Religiosity, who has the right God, has been the bane of civilization for thousands of years, eons. And having a God, having a goddess, having some being is problematic, because the development of the human spirit has to rest with each of us. A year or so ago, a goddess priestess said to me, "Oh, Trump's not a problem. She has a divine plan and he is part of it." And I was shocked. And I realized that this really crystallized for me the difference between capital T, capital G, capital S, she, as if there's somebody with the scorecard and we just have to worship. And that's a real difference from when women's spirituality began, where we were wild hags, hexing and taking power and calling into being the universe that we wanted, because we wanted it, not because we were worshipping the goddess and everything was flowers and beautiful. And there are religions that have no supreme being, the most famous of them being Buddhism, but the Baha'i have no supreme being. The Quakers, kind of, the deeply thinkful ones don't have a supreme being, they just have a conversation with the universe. And so goddesses exist in the same way that power animals and spirit beings and ghosts, they exist. They live in the non-material realms and they can pass through into the material realm, but they exist and they have wonderful powers. And if you can get one on your side to help out when you need something, it's like if you need to throw a rope across a ravine, having somebody that's on a baseball team or a cricket team who can throw, or an Olympic javelin thrower, is really fantastic. And if you knew one, you would ask them to come and do it for you. And I see goddesses like that they are beings that exist. And if you grow the plant or burn the incense or do the ceremony, you may get to know them. They may notice you. This is great, but they're not in charge. They have their own agendas and their own personalities and their own existence to deal with. And with the cataclysm that we are facing, with climate change, the collapse of the biosphere, the possibility that one day you'll turn on your tap and there will never be water in it again. And what happens then when we start to walk out and ask the neighbours, do you have any water? Did your electricity? And there's nobody to ring because there's no electricity and there's no water. Well, you can't stay there because there's no water, so where are you going to go? You're not going to go to the beach because that's salt. You're going to go to the rivers or the lakes, and everybody's going to go there. What is happening to the human spirit? And that isn't about worshipping. It's not about having a religiosity of trusting that somebody else will make it all right. That's about having the internal strength to cause a vibration of peaceful sharing. And if it means, and it will mean, that there's massive deaths, You know, like if the biosphere collapses, if civilization collapses, the way we have no skills in survival and the density of the populations means that there's really going to be crises and chaos and violence. And as a woman of peace and a woman of sacred female energy, I don't want this life to end up like Atlantis, where nobody believes it ever really existed. That is it, the development of the spirit. How are we going to develop a spirit in the youth, in the teenagers, in the elders, that will somehow be able to counteract the desperation and fear that will occur when the society crumbles? And I don't believe that it's worship. I believe that it's developing your own relationship with your own sacred. And it isn't a capital T, capital G, and it isn't a capital she. It's the self, the she in me, the she in we. It's the X chromosome that unites the human race, and we have it in double doses. And how are we are born in balance, that we in ourselves, women have XX, and so there is no conflict, there's no other. The othering occurs where there's the X and the Y. From the very first cell, it's an othering. There's an other. There's this and there's the other. There's this and the other. Whereas for a female cell, there is no othering occurs. And that, how do we find that and that strength to be the leaders in what will be the most extraordinary time of chaos and crisis? There you go.
Yeah.
I can't remember what question you asked me, but it all came out.
It's what you have spoken is extremely important. And yeah, it comes from within. It must come from within. My view and my understanding of, because I have an affinity with Hindu goddesses, she says in an ancient text, I am your innermost self. And so there's no separation. We look within, you know, it's not, and it's the same thing that you're saying. It is inside us, and we must find that place to be able to stand in that place of peace and that place of trust. You started out talking about trust in the circles that you had. And how do we then teach the younger people? You mentioned teaching the younger people, equipping them with how to respond when the civilization crumbles. And I guess the way to do that is to speak this simple truth and help them.
Life is sacred. All life is sacred. A human is not more important than a robin or a small worm or snake or the things we fear. A human is not more important than a spider.
Yeah. Yeah. So your art is imbued with these values. You do ceramic sculpture. Is your subject usually the female body or women, or would you share with us how your art is a spiritual process for you?
The making is for me far more important than the result. I began a fine arts degree when I was 61. And it was a constant problem because they were always interested in the output and I was always interested in the process. But no, it's rarely the female form. I do make vulval forms, but not necessarily specifically recognizable as vulva, although sometimes they are. I'm a scatterbrain. I can go off all over the place with thoughts and things. So one of my pieces was a ceramic questionnaire where every piece started off with a 42 centimetre cylinder, because 42 was the answer to life in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah, what is the meaning of life? The answer was 42. And so I started with these 42 centimetre cylinders, and I would focus on an emotion. And I made 5 of them, one for each emotion, and I would never tell anybody what the emotion was. And then I made 5 porcelain hearts from an oxen heart. So it was a real heart cast into porcelain as a money box thing. And I made little discs, gave them pencils, and said, if you happen to feel an emotion when looking at this work, please write something and put it in the money box. Because I was seeing if I could talk to people through, and so these are really different pieces of porcelain. And I was more than 70% correct. I used there's a list of words fitting emotions. And they start with the basic, anger, love, happy, hungry, whatever. And they spread out. So you end up with a lot of words. And when I did a database to match all the things that came in on the little porcelain dots against the emotion I had intended, I had actually succeeded in transmitting emotion through porcelain. So I can't transmit a biological sex because of the mindset of the watcher, but I can transmit an emotion. And so that was really interesting to me.
Very interesting. So what is, I have a talking point here from you when you say, what do you see as most important about now and the future? And you may have already covered this in what you've said. But what is most important about now and the future?
Defending women's space, women's sacred space. The Red Tent movement that recently withdrew from the pagan festival because they were pressured to allow males into women's space. And we need to maintain and protect women's space. Female, adult female, once you've passed your first menstruation, that adult female space, and then the menopausal woman's space, the crone space. Those are sacred conversations. And to have angry, young, liberal thinking protectors of the sad puppy that followed them home saying, you cannot have your sacred women's space because this puppy followed me and I really want to bring it in. And that kind of charitableness is incredibly destructive because that is our trained role. We as females are trained to make sure the men are comfortable. And this insisting that they be allowed to identify themselves in it's destructive because they are vibrationally different in every cell.
Yeah.
As I said, we are XX, they are XY. All of this stuff about whether they have a lady brain or not. They do not have XX. End of story. They cannot vibrate in the way that females can vibrate. And if we do not get to do that together, we cannot be attuned to the orgasm that is the universe.
Uh-huh. It's an energetic reality, isn't it, Spider? It's an energetic reality.
And the women that are fighting to prevent women's space happening have never experienced it. They don't know what it means. They haven't been there to value it.
Yeah. And once you do experience it, there's no denying it.
And there's no denying that when the others are present, and you can't be just passed off as, oh, you're just being phobic. It's like, no, when men are present, it doesn't happen. I had an example of this in Nairobi in 1985 at the World Conference on Women. We, along with American women, just put a little notice under a rock near the shrine of the sisterhood. The Sisterhood is Powerful shrine was there. And put a little piece of paper under a rock saying, there'll be a ceremony here, 4 o'clock Thursday. And we got there and there's like 300 women and 1 man. And we worked out how we would sit in a sort of a spiraling circle so that we could all hold hands. And we just sat down, held hands, and within 90 seconds, the man very quietly, he was an African man, and he just took the hands of the women next to them and joined them together, and he left. And nobody had said anything, but he was close enough to recognizing women's business that he knew he should not be there.
How
and
wonderful.
That's the point.
Yeah, how wonderful he sensed that. Yeah.
Our real allies leave us to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Our real allies.
I want to think, yeah. While I remember, I want to fit something in, because there is a place for what is the goddess religion that is being reclaimed as a religion. Here in Australia, there's a really big thing going on at the moment about religions in schools, because a lot of the fundamentalist religions are moving in and offering, you know, rock star afternoons and things. And in New South Wales schools, you can't teach curriculum if there's a religious thing. So all these other kids are missing out because they can't be taught anything because there's a religious thing. But these fundamentalist religions don't actually have status to do that. And they're taking up curriculum time. And very attractive because they're having rock concerts while everybody else is reading quietly in the library. So there's a movement of political women and atheists to control this. And I was asked if I would offer to teach goddess spirituality in religious studies. And I said no, but I went to the Australian woman, or I sent them to the Australian woman and said, tell her that Spider Redgold said that she would be the one. And she has temples and hierarchies of priestesses and is creating a religion of which she is the high priestess, which is not anything that I do at all. But in the context of pushing on the patriarchy and saying there is a goddess religion that if you are going to let these religions in, you have to let ours in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that falls into this place of whose religion. But that is going on here in Australia at the moment. And there is a very serious application that children in schools should have the opportunity to go Buddhist, Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, goddess. And so that's a very interesting little side stream that's going on. So if that is something that is essential in one's understanding of how to deal with life, then there's also a place that that can play out in a really positive liberationist way.
That is very interesting.
I wanted to make sure that I said
everything
else I've said about me being an atheist and anti-religiosity and all those things. And for me, ceremonies are always developed by the women who are at ceremony. There isn't a rule about how it is and what we have to do, and there isn't somebody that develops it and everybody follows it. That it's a creative process together. And so the power of the ceremony depends on the power of the women there rather than it being given to be followed.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's interesting seeing all of this other stuff happen about religion in schools, and the very real possibility that if they decide they want the newer Christian religions, big ones like Hillsong, multi-millionaire religions, then they may need to include goddess religion. That would be a very interesting thing. And their misogyny may mean that by refusing goddess religion, they have to refuse all these others as well.
Well, does the goddess religion have legal status in Australia?
It does. In Australia, religions can only be incorporated associations. And there are incorporated goddess associations in every state.
Okay. In the United States here, we have the Temple of Diana and the Reformed Congregation of the Goddess. They are legally recognized religions, churches with legal standing, and so it's a place, the only place where you can go in the United States with the gender identity laws that are being made. There are 19 states or more in the United States that have gender identity laws that you're a woman if you say you are, regardless of biology. But because of the religion, the Temple of Diana, and this federally recognized religion, women can gather alone without any males. But that's the only place in those various states, the 19 states. Yeah. Otherwise, you have to allow a male in. Yeah. Who says he's a woman.
We don't legally recognize religion like that, but there is a UN Convention on the Protection of Belief and being able to gather of like mind. And I recently complained to the Australian Human Rights Commission about being denied access to a lesbian health conference because of my belief that men cannot become women. And I wrote to them and said, I'm being denied access. And they wrote back and said, all the laws in Australia are about gender and sex, and they're not denying you access because of your sex or because of your gender. They're denying you access because of your belief. And we can't act on that. And I've got that in writing. And so for us, my next step, this has only happened in the last 2 months, my next step is to declare a big event where you are required to sign and swear that you believe that men cannot be women. And you can't come if you're not prepared to sign that.
There you go.
The Human Rights Commission has
turn it around.
You can exclude on the grounds of their scientific belief.
Turning it around. Spider, your bandwidth. I have a note that says I have a bandwidth that says a note that says your bandwidth is low, and I'm beginning to lose some of our connection here. But I did hear,
okay.
I did get this whole turnaround that you've done about the belief, and I hope that turns out well for you.
Right. Yes. Well, this is the next thing, is where there's some sort of big public thing that says it's only for people that believe that men cannot be women. It's only for women that believe that men cannot be women, and we'll see what happens, because I have it in writing from the Human Rights Commission.
That is brilliant. That is brilliant. So before we get cut off, because like I said, the bandwidth is getting kind of weird and getting a little blurry, I want to just ask if you have any last thing that you would like to share. It's been an extremely rich conversation with you. Any last few words to the people watching and listening?
It's a self-revealing path, and you will know in your body you have a inner bell, and when you strike a bell and it sounds clear, and you strike a bell and there's something against it so it's muffled, you can tell the difference. And that's what I say, is you can tell what is right for you and develop every strength possible so that you're not frightened to do what is right for you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's right to the core, right to the core. There's going to be, I'll have links that accompany this interview so people get in touch with you online and find you online. And that was, I just want everybody to know that the text will accompany the interview and they can get in touch with you that way or track what you're doing. And I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. Very rich discussion. Thank you for your time and your wisdom.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I am so honored to be included.
And we will continue on. Maybe we'll have a follow-up interviews 5 years from now with everyone and see how things are going. Yeah.
If there's still technology.
Well, that's true. We better get our survival skills going, huh? That's a good idea.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Spider. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye for now.